Hello, everyone, and welcome to San Francisco Opera Guild's first virtual preview of the 2024-25 season, Verdi's Un ballo in maschera, or A Masked Ball. I'm Lauren Erickson, San Francisco Opera Guild board member, and we're thrilled to welcome Professor Simon Williams to learn about this exciting opera that opens our season on September 6th at the War Memorial Opera House. A fitting opera for an opening night gala, given the word ball is in the title. Now, before we jump in, I'd like to share a little bit of information about San Francisco Opera Guild and our mission. We were established in 1939, and while we are technically a separate nonprofit organization from the San Francisco Opera Association, many of our programs are in support of the opera, including these opera previews. But our primary commitment is to bring quality education and arts engagement programs to schools and the community. You might be familiar with our school programs such as Opera Together, formerly known as Opera a la carte, and our student dress rehearsal program. But we have an incredible variety of offerings for students K through 12 to ignite a creative spark and grow curiosity about the arts while teaching collaboration, self-esteem, along with critical and metaphorical thinking skills. I encourage you to learn more about the Guild's work by visiting us at sfoperaguild.com. For today, if you have questions throughout the event, please drop them in the chat. We'll do our best to address them. Now on to the main event. We are pleased to have Professor Simon Williams, Emeritus Professor in the Department of Theater and Dance at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and an active director of both opera and spoken drama, is internationally recognized as an authority on the history of acting and Shakespearean performance, on opera as drama, and on the history of operatic staging. He has lectured worldwide on Wagner, served for several years as lecturer for English-speaking audiences at the Bayreuth Festival, and has spoken on a wide range of operas at both opera houses and opera guilds worldwide. He is principal speaker at the annual Exciting Opera at Oakhurst weekend in the California Sierras, and has authored 4 books on German theater, 2 of them on Wagner, as well as serving as co-editor of the first English language history of German theater and chief editor of the Cambridge Encyclopedia of Stage Actors and Acting. Welcome, Simon.
Well, thank you very much, Lauren, for that very kind introduction. I hope you all hear me.
Yeah.
You can hear me.
Now, Simon, yeah, we're good. We can hear you.
Okay.
Now, I want to just ask you a couple questions before we have you dive in. So we all know Verdi as a powerhouse composer of opera, Traviata, Aida, Rigoletto, just to name a few. Un ballo is not necessarily unfamiliar in the opera world, but I'm curious what your thoughts are on why do you think SF Opera chose it as their opening night opera for the season? Seems like a big decision.
It is a big decision, but they chose it for it is an absolutely first-class opera, entirely of the quality of Rigoletto and the other sort of powerhouse operas you've mentioned. And I hope that this is what I will demonstrate in my talk this evening.
Excellent. Now, I thought we would just take a quick peek at the official poster for this production by SF Opera. And I thought we could just take a look at it and say, what kind of things jump out at you? And maybe what hints do you think that we're getting for what the production might be looking like? So just would love to pick your brain on that for a minute.
Well, at the moment I can't see the poster because I've got my actual presentation on my screen. But
okay, well,
I have seen it, and
yes, okay.
I like its elegance, the sort of the somewhat mysterious quality of the 2 characters. It's very elegant. I'm not entirely sure that the entire opera is as elegant as this poster says, but because it's a very mixed score, but it's very arresting. And in particular, I find the sort of the mixing up of the eyes and the mask and the chandelier works very effectively. And it's also nicely colored. In fact, some of the colors of this are in fact sort of the colors on the background of my slides as well.
Excellent. Well, that's awesome. Thank you so much for giving us a little sneak peek there. So I will let you take it from here, and we really
Okay,
look forward to your presentation. So thank you so much for joining us.
right, thank you. Now let me just got to bring it up again, I think, here. Right. Just excuse me while I do a little bit of, there we go. Well, good evening, everybody. It's a tremendous pleasure to be here. And in particular, it's a real pleasure because I'm talking about one of my favorite operas. And as you've just heard in that little chat I had with Lauren, this is an opera that is, as far as I'm concerned, is right there up there at the top in as far as the quality of Verdi's work is concerned. It's one of his liveliest and most original operas, and in it, he displays his astonishing versatility and range as a composer, perhaps a wider range than one had ever seen before. It's a work that actually has virtually no parallel in the operatic repertoire, and I will be explaining why that is so in a few moments. It's also a key work in the most productive and, if I may say, the most transitional period of his career, when he was moving away from conventional Italian opera into more interesting forms. But I should say this is one of the operas that caused him a tremendous amount of trouble. And so perhaps I should begin by just examining that trouble a bit. Now, by 1857, when he was in his 40s, Verdi was an internationally celebrated composer. And he was approached by the Teatro San Carlo in Naples, one of the 2 or 3 most distinguished theaters in Italy at that time, and indeed still today. But the Teatro San Carlo commissioned an opera from him. And he agreed, and he wanted to write King Lear. This had always been his ambition as an opera composer, to write King Lear. But there were no suitable singers, and he realized that it was just not possible to put on this King Lear without the singers that he really had in mind and needed for the different roles. And so instead, he decided to adapt the libretto of a grand opera that had already been widely seen in Europe. And this was an opera by Daniel Aubert and Eugen Scribe, the librettist, and it was Un bal masqué, a masked ball, and it had been produced about 25 years before at the Paris Opera, and it had already been seen very widely. It was about the assassination of the Swedish king, Gustav III, that actually occurred in 1792. Now, for many people, it was a real puzzle as to why Verdi chooses to set this libretto. After all, the opera had been seen, people who are familiar with the story, and it was really basically a used libretto. It had also been used by other composers fairly successfully. But Verdi was among the more stubborn members of the composer fraternity, and as he was, Verdi prevailed, and his opinion was the one that carried. And so the composition of his adaptation of Un bal masqué was well advanced by the end of 1857. And then at the end of the year, he presented to the management and to the local censors in Naples the opera under the title Gustavo III. And it could only be performed once the management had agreed to it, and in particular, the censors had. And actually, the opera itself is essentially a fictional dramatization leading up to the assassination of Gustav III in Stockholm, which had taken place in March 1792. 1942, almost 100 years after, 100 years behind the time when Verdi was starting to compose his work. Now, although Auber's opera Un bal masqué, when it came on in Paris in 1833, it was not unduly censored. Verdi ran into trouble. And why was this so? Well, first, political circumstances were very different in 1858 than they were in 1833. In 1833, there was sort of a relatively sort of calm political atmosphere in Europe. But a few years later, back in 1848, there would be the outburst of the 1848 revolution, which in fact took place throughout Europe in various cities, but was particularly powerful and brutal in North Italy. And here we can see one of the riots and sort of street battles that took place in Milan. Now, the 1848 revolution was only 9 years in the past when Verdi submitted the score and the libretto to the censor. And people were rather uncertain about how well established how settled European politics were. And things got even worse when in January of 1858, when the censors were actually considering the opera, there was in Paris an attempted assassination of the Emperor Napoleon III. He escaped, but at the same time, this was still an event that caused a lot of public stir and uncertainty. And in addition to this, in Italy, one also had the Risorgimento, which was an armed rebellion or an armed sort of almost sort of a civil war in which the troops which were in fact gathered from throughout Italy, they formed an army in order to get rid of the royalist governments. And in 1860, just 2 years after Verdi had submitted the score, Garibaldi, who was one of the great leaders of the Risorgimento, entered Naples and captured the city, and the royal government was dissolved, and eventually Italy became a unified political whole under the Republic of Italy. So these were violent times, and I can understand why the censors might have been a little bit nervous about this. Talking about this to somebody just a couple of days ago, I actually said, I wonder if I'd been a censor in Naples, maybe I'd have had worries about Verdi's opera as well. Anyway, you can be sure there was trouble. The management informed Verdi and Sommer that the censors considered that there were problems with the libretto. And this was the start of an extended struggle between the authorities and the censors. Here we have a cartoon from the time where Verdi, who's looking all the world like a sort of a hippie from the 1960s, is here being sort of attacked by a hysterical member of some authoritarian institution. And the objections they had to the score and to the libretto were myriad. They began with objections saying we should not show the death of a monarch on the stage. And then they listed a whole list of changes they want, basically details referring to sexual morality and politics. And they said, if you are going to put this on, we really have to change Gustav, the king, to a duke. And they suggested that they, in fact, changed him to the Duke of Stettin in Pomerania in northern Germany. Not quite so sure that would have appealed too widely to audiences. But anyway, Verdi sort of got increasingly angry about this. They suggested other places and other titles. And eventually, Verdi just sort of lost his temper, threw up his arms, sued San Carlo, and took his opera to Rome. And it was in Rome that he found the Teatro Apollo. And the Teatro Apollo was quite happy to, in fact, put on the opera. Indeed, this was the opera in which only about 4 years before the Il Trovatore had its world premiere. So it was an institution that Verdi was quite familiar with. And here they accepted the opera, and then the management and the local censors in Rome said, we will put it on, but with one condition, is the whole action of the opera has to be shifted from Europe to America, colonial America, which sort of suggests that people did not feel that colonial America was a particularly dangerous sort of powder keg of an issue to present on the stage. But it would be set in Boston in the 17th century, which was governed by a gentleman with the title of Il Conte de Warwick, or the Duke of Warwick, who also was given the name Riccardo. Verdi once again threw up his arms in amazement. And then he conceded and said, let's do it. And it came on at the Teatro Apollo in Rome on the 17th of February, 1859. And it was an instant success. Verdi never objected to the American setting. And in fact, he allowed the opera to be continued to be set in America. And it has actually been a firm fixture in the repertoire ever since. Now, until the mid-20th century, it was played only in the American version. But actually, I was a teacher in Stockholm in the mid-1960s, and I can remember going to see a production of Un ballo in maschera at the Royal Swedish Opera, and it was set in Sweden. Ragnar Olfung was singing the lead, and this, I believe, was the first production to be set in Sweden since the 19th century. Since then, the Swedish setting has become more and more popular. And you will still find that American versions are used. But quite frankly, I applaud the San Francisco Opera for choosing the Swedish version. It's much more sort of compelling, in fact, than the American version. And more than that, the production that we are going to see started at the opera in Rome. That wasn't in the Teatro Apollo in Rome, because that had been swept away by a flood in 1888. But in the theatre that is now, of course, the Rome Opera that succeeded the Teatro Apollo. So there is a nice sort of link here between today's performance and the first performance of Un ballo in maschera. Now, before I say anything more, maybe I had better just go over just give a synopsis of the libretto so you can have some idea of what happens. Even though various versions of the opera were proposed by censors and everything, there is actually a fairly standard version of the opera, which is the one we will be hearing in San Francisco. Now, it begins in the court in Stockholm, and Gustav III, who is King of Sweden from 1771 to 1792, he is holding court, and he is holding court with his page Oscar. and he's surrounded, got a lot of courtiers around. He is presented with a list of guests for a masked ball, which is going to be taking place in a few days' time. And he notes on this list the name of Amelia Ankerstrom. She is the wife of Count Ankerstrom, who is a close friend and secretary to Gustav. Gustav is in ecstasy that Amelia will be there because he is in love with her, even though the husband is his close friend and his secretary. He loves his wife. Ankerstrom enters, and then he tells Gustav that there is a conspiracy to murder him. Gustav looks at him and then just laughs him off and says, we'll get over it. He is then told about a fortune teller, a lady by the name of Madame Ulrika Arvidsson, and she is to be deported for witchcraft because she's telling fortunes in a cave and she's attracting a lot of attention. And the Lord Chief Justice comes in and says, we got to deport her. And Gustav decides, no, I will go and see her myself, and then I will decide. And then he invites the entire court to get disguised and come with him to Madame Arvidsson. Now, the second scene of this opening act actually takes place in the cave where Madame Arvidsson is telling her fortunes. And she has a crowd of superstitious believers, of sailors, of seamen, and local folk. And while she's sort of telling these fortunes, she says to a soldier, a sailor, a gentleman by the name of Silvano, that he will receive a large amount of money and promotion in his career. Now, Gustav, who's already looking on, he very quickly writes out the promotion and then takes a bag of money out of his pocket and places the money and the promotion in Silvano's pocket. Silvano looks at it and says, "Oh, this is marvelous." And of course, everybody bursts into applause and praises Madame Arvidsson for her ability to foretell the future. Now, at this point, Amelia, this is the first time we've seen Amelia, she comes in and she wants to talk to Madame Arvidsson. She wishes to rid herself of her love for Gustav. Although she is deeply in love with him, this is causing her such guilt that she really needs to, in fact, deal with it. And she wants to know how to get rid of that love. And Ulrika tells her to visit a site outside the city. Actually, it's where criminals are hanged. And if she goes beneath the gallows, she will find there a herb. And if she takes this herb, it will rid her of her love. Gustav overhears this. He's listening to all these different activities going on stage. And he decides he will follow Amelia. But before he does, he asks Ulrika to tell his fortune. And he goes and he puts out his hand, and Ulrika looks at it and then says, "You are going to be killed at the hand of your closest friend, and it will be soon." That's a pretty rough thing to hear, bit of news to hear. Everybody sort of starts away. And then suddenly Ankerstrom comes in because he's coming in on official business to tell Gustav about things that are happening. And Gustav goes out to him, shakes him by the hand, and then says, "Here's my closest friend. He's not going to murder me." And so he says to Madame Arvidsson, "You are harmless," and allows her to stay. Now, Act 2, which is in many ways a big sort of grand act, the Amelia arrives at the gallows and she sings a fairly developed aria on the misery of her love life. It's a very impressive piece of music. Gustav enters, and there follows the most passionate love duet between them. It is probably the most passionate love duet in all of Verdi. Indeed, I find it is one of the most passionate love duets anywhere in opera. It is actually one of my favorite pieces of music. I'll come back to it a bit later. There is this love duet. They declare their love. And then Ankerström, the husband, comes rushing on stage and he warns Gustav that the conspirators are headed by the two leaders, Count Ribbing and Count Horn. They are approaching and they plan to kill him. Gustav leaves and he says to Ankerström, would you take this lady back to town? But whatever you do, do not remove her veil and her mask. He leaves after making that demand, and he says, you should never not ask who she is. The conspirators arrive, and they're very angry to see that Ankerström is there, but not Gustav, who they had hoped to be confronting. And because of this, in anger, they tear the veil off Amelia's face. And Ankerström is appalled to see his wife there. The conspirators mock him, they laugh at him, and then at the end he says to them, visit me tomorrow. That's the end of that very, very sort of powerful and compact act. The final act begins in Ankerström's house. Ankerström threatens to kill Amelia, but then eventually decides that it's not Amelia who should die, but Gustav. The conspirators arrive, as in fact Ankerström had invited them to, and Ankerström tells them that he will join them. They ultimately agree to this, and then they draw straws as to who is to kill Gustav. And Ankerström draws the short straw, which is the one that will kill him. Oscar then enters and invites all of them to a masked ball. This scene actually lasts about half an hour, and it's got some wonderfully emotional passages in it. I'll be touching on those a little bit later. And then we finish in the ballroom back at the palace. In a major solo just before the ball, Gustav determines to renounce his love for Amelia and to send Ankerström and Amelia on a diplomatic mission. As he finishes the aria, everyone sweeps on stage for the ball. And after a considerable amount of intrigue among people, Ankerström stabs Gustav, who dies amidst his subjects. In his dying speech, he tells Ankerström that Amelia is innocent and that, in fact, she has done nothing. And the opera ends with a mourning chorus. Now, of all these figures, Gustav, Horn, Ankerström, Horn, Ribbing, and Madame Arvidsson do have historical parallels. All the others, including Amelia and the love affair, are fictional. Now, why did Verdi choose a familiar libretto and stick to it even when it ran into trouble? Well, it has a unique placement in Verdi's output, both musically and with regard to content. And I think that in both of this is, we can find here two reasons why he chose this story. First, ballo sits right in the middle of Verdi's, stands right in the center of what is called Verdi's middle period. By the mid-1850s, Verdi was internationally recognized as the leading Italian composer. And this was due primarily to these three operas, Rigoletto, that was first performed in 1851, Il Trovatore, that was first performed in 1853, and La Traviata, that was also performed in 1853. In some ways, these, well, I don't think in some ways, at this point in Verdi's life, these three operas were the supreme achievement of his career so far. And indeed, they still are among the most frequently performed of all operas in the repertoire. And I'm talking about the international repertoire as well as the Italian. Now, a notable feature of them is they depend quite strongly upon patterns of melodies and patterns and models that come from the bel canto period. Now, the bel canto period was in general, went from about 1810 through to the mid-1850s. And the notable period, a notable feature of bel canto and of Verdi's early operas is the dominance of musical numbers. The performance was composed of a series of set pieces, all of which followed a regular pattern. So arias, duets, ensembles, choruses, all of which were linked by accompanied recitative. These numbers actually had a similar structure. It was repeated time and time again. It was subject to some very interesting variations, but it was, in some ways, it got in the way of the flow of the action because each bel canto piece was a complete piece of music that had to be fulfilled and ended before one moved into the next phase of the action. Now, in fact, bel canto was tremendously popular because of the wonderful melodies that it produced. But for the composers, this was a problem because they wished for the music to realize the action, to embody the action, to give body and meaning to the action. The set pieces actually tended to slow up or halt the action. And almost invariably, they were applauded. So an opera could be seen almost as sort of like a concert in costume with a series of sort of different pieces, all of which, whether they were arias or whether they were ensembles, all of which tended to follow the same structure. Now, what was that structure? Well, just to take an example from the bel canto form, the aria. The aria was in, actually not just the aria, actually all different musical structures, but let us focus on the aria as it's perhaps the simplest. Arias normally began with a cavatina or a cantabile, and this was an often slow melody, often very moving, and it developed the emotional state of the character and allowed us to judge how happy or unhappy that character was, how they were being drawn, being sort of oppressed by feelings or made happy by feelings. And the cavatina, which actually lasted quite a long time, some of the cavatinas go on for, sort of 10, 12 minutes. This was followed by a tempo di mezzo, and this was again a change in mood. It would be started off by the singer, him or herself, perhaps thinking, oh, maybe I should think about my situation from this point of view rather than this one. And so there would be a change in mood. Often the tempo di mezzo would be started off by a servant coming in or a messenger coming in and saying, this is happening over here. And the person who hears it realizes that what is happening over there actually has considerable importance to their own inner feelings. And sometimes, occasionally, a tempo di mezzo might even be a whole chorus coming in and giving information about something that's occurring. Once this has occurred, the singer then is filled with energy and decides that this might help me solve my problems, or it might help me improve my situation. And so this last part of the aria is the cabaletta. This is a very vigorous piece of music. It's the concluding section. It's fast, it's agile, and it displays the technical versatility of the singer. Now let's just take an example of what this is like. In Il Trovatore, which has a lot of bel canto features in it, Leonora's aria, opening aria, she's Leonora's is the heroine of the piece. She has an aria, Tacea la notte, that comes from the first act. And in this aria, she recalls that she fell in love with the troubadour as he played her a serenade outside her window. And she recalls this as a marvelously sort of transfiguring moment.
Hey Simon, it's Max. You might have to do your screen share again, optimizing for sound.
Sorry?
You might need to optimize for sound. It's a little tough to hear.
Okay.
It's getting better, actually. Never mind. Sorry.
Okay. Tell me if there's a problem. Yeah. Now, that's a wonderful melody. It's long, it's languorous. Those of you who know the opera very well probably want to put a bullet through my head, because Leonora is just about to go into one of Verdi's most marvelous sort of rising lines. But anyway, the cavatina, this melody is sung once and then repeated with variations. And that can be quite a long process. And then comes the tempo di mezzo. And in this particular case, it is of Inez, who is Leonora's maid, coming in and saying, just get this man out of your head. There's no way you can marry him. You've got to be more realistic. Now, Leonora, when Inez tries to, in fact, persuade her to leave the troubadour, she refuses. No, she's absolutely filled with defiance, and she's even more strongly depends upon the strength of her feeling. And here we have the cabaletta in which she expresses that. She's even more determined to love him as before, and she concludes the aria with a tremendous elaboration. Now, I left that applause on because it was applause that, in fact, several composers did not like, and Verdi was not that keen on it as well. They did not want applause to break into the action of the piece. And I'm quite sure in the highly competitive world of Italian opera in the 19th century, there was a fair amount of jealousy as to who got the main applause. Did the singer get it, or did the composer get it. That performance, by the way, was a live performance, which is why it was a little bit down. Everything else is, you'll find the volumes much better. But it was a live performance at the Salzburg Festival back in 1968. And the singer was Leontin Price, and the conductor was Herbert von Karajan. And that gives you some idea, but it gives you some idea of how these sort of these bel canto arias were presented with a tremendous bloom. They were real sort of musical sort of masterpieces. But anyway, in Verdi's later operas, this is the operas after Ballo and Maschera, while arias are not absent, and indeed you can still find bel canto structured arias in his later operas, on the whole, arias tend to be shorter, and they're in one section rather than in three. And as a result, the continuity of the action is felt more directly. And in fact, the continuity of music became increasingly a major concern. And it is actually in Ballo and Maschera where we can first feel the breakdown of formal musical structures in order to achieve a sort of a more accurate and more exciting sort of body of music that drives the action forward. This of course was the creating a continuous music was also the central ambition of Wagner in creating his music dramas, but he did it in a very, very different way from Verdi. Now, but why did Verdi choose Gustav III or the Earl of Warwick as his subject matter? Well, here we just need to cast our eye a bit on the later operas of Verdi. After La Traviata, which was a great success, after La Traviata, the next operas saw Verdi moving away from conventional musical structures and more trying to make the music part of the dramatic language. The first of these is Les Vespres Siciliennes, the Sicilian Vespers, which is an exercise in French grand opera. It is quite an interesting piece. By the way, I think I have the date wrong there. I think it's 1853. After this, we have Simon Boccanegra, one of the most beautiful operas ever written, and that it deals with the sort of the problems that a doge of Genoa has in ruling his country. Then there is Ballo and Maschera, which we're looking at, 1859, and this is followed by La Forza del Destino, 1862, an opera that many of you, I'm sure, have seen. Maybe you saw it in the Met transmission earlier this year. And then Don Carlos of 1867 and Aida of 1871. Now, actually, for me, and I think I can say for many Verdians, not necessarily all Verdians, but many, these works tend to represent the high point of Verdi's career. They are profoundly moving. They show a constantly developing subtlety in characterization. They show an intensification of Verdi's melodic genius. So he found melodies that really sort of expressed the dramatic situation very powerfully. They demonstrate a mastery of orchestration, a thrilling dramatic power, and a great continuity of action. And interestingly enough, all of them, with the exception of La Forza del Destino, all of them deal with politics. All, in fact, move into the realm that Auber's Bal Masqué had, in fact, sort of moved into a few decades before. Now, what were the politics here? Well, Verdi, when he was a young man, back in the 1840s and before, developed the reputation of being an ardent Italian nationalist, and his early operas especially seem to express this nationalism. However, if this was true, it's surprising that most critics, when they first encountered Verdi's operas, didn't really take much notice of the naturalism. And when Verdi's nationalism was mentioned to him, he disparaged the idea and he said, "I'm not really writing nationalistic operas." However, there's no doubt that many of his choruses, such as the chorus of the Hebrew slaves, lent themselves to political causes. I can remember being in Turin during an election and hearing an orchestra playing the hymn of the Hebrew slaves in the piazza in support of one of the political parties that was in competition. Yes, and that there was some nationalistic music or music that appealed to nationalistic emotions. But we also know that Verdi supported the Risorgimento and even briefly served for a few months in 1861 in the first parliament in the Republic of Italy, the United Republic of Italy. But he was never really the firebrand that myth might make him out to be. And the political operas that he wrote, both in the past, but particularly here in these 6 operas or 5 operas that I have put up there, these political operas are not about nationalism. Rather, they are dramatic studies of individuals living in political circumstances. They're studies of rulers and the decisions that rulers are forced to make, of the clash between political necessity and private emotions. Propaganda for a particular party was the furthest from Verdi's mind. It was the conduct of human beings in political situations that Verdi was interested in, just as Shakespeare was interested in that. And this is actually the reason why Auber's ballo masqué appealed to him. For a start, the action seemed ideal for sort of developing this somewhat more sort of this faster and less number-driven desire, number-driven structure for the music. And secondly, they actually dealt with the Auber dealt with politics, and this was something that Verdi was particularly interested in. And I have to applaud the San Francisco Opera for doing the Swedish version because it's much more appropriate than the American. Now, let me move on to the opera itself. The court of Gustav III was a characteristic court of the European Enlightenment. Gustav was one of those rulers who tried to reduce the power of the aristocracy in order to support the interests of the people. However, like many other liberal monarchs of this period, as he got older, he grew increasingly autocratic. And however, while he in fact lost most support from the aristocrats, he always remained popular with the people. Now, among his most significant achievements, other than sort of political and bureaucratic reforms, he also cultivated the arts to a vastly higher degree than any previous Swedish monarch had done. And above all, he founded the Royal Swedish Opera in 1782. That opera, the opera that is still in existence today, and in which I happened to see what was probably the very first performance of Ballo in Maschera in its proper Swedish setting. Now, actually, Gustav was a fascinating figure, both for his character and for his historic importance. He had a charisma that ensured his popularity and enabled him to create a highly cultivated court. He was also a bon viveur. The court was noted for its festivities. Gustav was a free-spiriting individual. He was almost certainly bisexual and made very little attempt to hide this. Now, Verdi does wonders in establishing the character of Gustav and of the court as sort of an extension of his personality. From the opening scene, we get a sense of Gustav as a figure not of oppressive authority or serious nobility, but a figure of lightness, someone who plays with life rather than seeks to dominate it. In the opening moments of the opera, Gustav has seen a list of invitees to the ball, and he reads Amelia's name on it. And his response is not extended bel canto style aria, but a brief solo that instantly encapsulates both his character and his love, and also establishes the atmosphere of his court. La rivedrà nell'estasi bracciante di pallore e qui suonare d'amore la sua parola potrà suonar d'amore. Oh, dolce notte scendere tu puoi, gemmata festa ma la mia stella questa che il ciel non ha, questa è mia stella. Come all that in 2 minutes, actually 1 minute and 58 seconds precisely. It's amazing how much Verdi gets into that. He clearly establishes Gustav's character. We get a sense that of him as a sort of an artistic person. We get a sense of him also as somebody who is deeply moved by love. And also we can see, actually, as he relates to people, that he does still have a sort of a real loyalty in some of the court, not all of the court. Its ballo is noted for its compactness, whereby Verdi manages to sort of put a considerable amount of meaning into a relatively small space. This recording, by the way, that I'm playing is nominally set in America. It's from Parma in northern Italy from about 10 years ago. But the production has primarily European features. This is hardly colonial Boston, where court spectacle had probably never been seen. But although the costumes of the 17th century of Puritans and Cavaliers, royal trappings dominate. And the singers, by the way, the Gustavo is sung by Francesco Melli, and the Ankerstrom by Vladimir Stoyanov, and Amelia will be sung by Kristen Lewis. Notice in this scene also that the music is courtly. the page Oscar, who we actually did hear there, she's in white, played by a woman. This is the only trousers role in Verdi. Normally he disliked them, but he felt that, in fact, the lightness of the music required a female voice. And then close to the end of the scene, the Chief Lord Justice comes in demanding that Ulrika be exiled, but he is sort of dismissed as if he's really not of that much importance. And the act ends with Gustav inviting the whole court to visit Ulrika in her cave. And at this point, they break into an ensemble that is unique, and it's actually really a bit of a surprise in a Verdi opera. And when the ensemble begins, you can be sure that Signor Verdi is there conducting on the podium. But at some point, fairly soon after the ensemble begins, he seems to sort of move off, and the podium is taken over by Monsieur Offenbach. This is actually quite an interesting shift of style in Verdi. I mean, he had a lighter style in La Traviata and a few other operas, but this is sort of interesting how we move from a sort of an Italian idiom to an unmistakably French one.
Signori, oggi d'Ulrica alla magion d'invito, ma sul paltro vestito io la sarò davvero, si può gustar la scena, direno le prudente. La cosa c'è che mi piace. E ravvisa cantuno e di patria, al tema, e vedi tu tema, adesso così è. E tu m'appronta l'abito da pescator. L'abito sa particolare. Ogni cura si dogna di letto e s'accorra nel magico tetto, tra la folla dei preti ognuno s'abbandoni con lecchi con me. E s'accorra ma ben di sospetto, ed ognuno i periti che tremano in cor, s'abbandoni con lecchi al mediani con me, e con lecchi che nulla paventa per sé. Indovina di legge dov'è questa ben criterio di vino, sentirò se marito di stelle di quale sorte mi deve da te. E s'accorra si dogna da cielo. Dunque signor, ti aspetto di signor, ti aspetto di cognito, al vetrare, approvando la pulonea del oracolo, e la bramava il piede e la campava.
Hey Simon, it's Max. Do you mind pausing for just a sec? Simon.
Yeah.
It's kind of cutting out when the larger ensemble parts are happening. Would you mind restarting the share to make sure sound is optimized?
Could we just take a moment's break, because I understand somebody wants to speak about the quality of the sound. Max, what were you saying?
Yeah, sorry about that. It's cutting out during the ensemble portions. I think there's too much sound. I think we might need to restart screen share, making sure that optimize for sound and video are selected. I think that might not have happened this round.
Okay, can you just sort of all hang in there, and I'll see if I can do that.
It's just such a great song. I think everyone wants to hear it.
Yes. Hang on a moment. Now, what do I do? I don't do that. I think I might have to go out.
Well, I think if you just try screen sharing again, and when the screen share initially opens, there's buttons on the side to let you optimize for sound.
Okay. Okay. Yes, they have gone, but they were on before.
I think because we were messing around with showing the PR image, it might have
Okay.
changed your settings.
Do you want to hear that last bit again?
I think we should do it again. I think it's
We
worth
should.
it.
The last ensemble.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, here we
All right.
go.
Thank you. Hang in there, everyone. Sorry about that.
Oh, good. That's later. Hang on a moment. I'm gonna have to get us back to that. Oh, right. Now.
Yes, very good. Thank you.
Io la sarò, davvero, si può gustar la scena, l'idea non è prudente.
La truanza eccellente, feconda di piacere.
Per ravvisar l'uno e di patria, qual tema? E vedi tutto tema, codesto consiglier. E tu ma pronto navito, da pescator. Sacramente caladito, lo saprà il vincolo. Ogni cura si dogna di letto e s'accorra nel magico tetto. Tra la folla dei preti ognuno s'abbandoni e folleggi con me. E s'accorra ma belli si spera sui perigli che premono intorno. S'abbandoni, protegga il magnanimo bello e folleggi che nulla m'aventa per sé.
L'indovina ne dice di belle e sta ben che l'interroghi io. Sentirò se marito le stelle di quella sorte benefica me.
E s'accorra, e si vede. Dunque signor, vi aspettovi, incognito, alle trene, prometto, trappolone, altro dell'oracolo, e la gran maga al piede, la gran maga al piede. Ogni cura si dogna di mezzi, e s'accorda al faghin potessi, per un dissi folleggi si scherzi, ma la vita più cara non è. Che il magnano animo
Now, the dominant music in that first scene becomes the music of the operetta. And this is the music of celebration. It's the music of parties. It's the music of having a good time. And yet at the same time, the dramatic situation as it is developing is that of a man who loves life. And he can call upon many individuals' loyalty because they do have a sort of a personal connection to him. But maybe he's inadequate. He seems to be more bound up in his private than his public life, which is something that really public figures shouldn't do. And certainly he seems to confuse the public and the private. Perhaps he's not a man who has much responsibility. Perhaps he is as much an actor as he is a politician. Perhaps he's only an actor. And so one of the important things about this opera it makes us look, actually quite ironically, at the nature of a politician and make us ask what makes political rules successful or unsuccessful. The crucial point, however, is that Verdi was actually treading on very tricky operatic terrain, that of tragicomedy. Although tragicomedy is a common genre in spoken drama, it's not actually nearly so as common as in opera. Music is a very persuasive dramatic language. And if you have spent 5 minutes persuading the audience of the depth of somebody's emotions, of how deep they feel, and then suddenly you change to a lighter tone that is comic, this shift can be quite disturbing and discombobulating for an audience. And as a result, there tend to be fairly few successful tragicomedies. There are some, and the ones that are very effective. But ballo is certainly, I think, one of those successful tragicomedies. And it does allow us to see the action from more than one point of view. We can identify with Gustav, but we can see him ironically. Compare him, for example, to Manrico in Il Trovatore a few years ago, and Manrico only really has stage credibility if we actually believe in his energy and believe in his in the goodness that he is supposed to represent. So here we have a very different relationship to the characters. But the contrast between light and dark, between operetta and opera, between frivolous and tragic, is an unusual mix and was quite rare in the 1860s. Interestingly enough, the lighter conversational style of music is maintained through to the finale of the opera. You don't hear it all the time. There are passages that have sort of more the sort of the seriousness that one expects of grand opera, but there are passages right the way through to the end of the opera in which we hear the music of revelry, the music of dance, and we hear light comedy mixed with a darker ironic music that makes us smile even when we shudder. For example, when in Act 2, the conspirators unveil Amelia and Ankerstrom discovers that his wife is actually having an affair with Gustav, the conspirators don't expect moral horror, far from it. They laugh sardonically at his discomfort.
Lei, sua moglie.
O ciel pietà,
Sua moglie.
o ciel pietà,
Sua moglie. Amelia. Sei in notte qui con la sposa, l'innamorato campion si posa. E come al raggio lunar del miele sulle rugiade corcar si sa. Ha 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 ha. E che baccano sul caso sta, e che commenti per la città, e che baccano sul caso sta, e che commenti per la città.
This sort of mixture of darkness with a sort of this light sardonic music is relatively rare in opera and relatively rare in Verdi. One does get it. Rigoletto certainly has some of those sardonic choruses from conspirators as well, but it's not a sort of a particularly common idiom. And it leads to powerful sort of swings in the action. We move from the court, dominated in many ways by Offenbachian music, to Ulrike's Cave, which is sort of Gothic and got the darkness of a grand opera, to the Gallows, where we'll be dealing with that in a moment, where the opera moves into a different mode altogether. Then we have Ankerström's House, where we move into a really tight sort of tragic situation. Then we go back to the ballroom at court at the end. Verdi lays on the Gothic atmosphere so strongly that we find ourselves shuddering and smiling at the same time. This sustained mood of irony is, I think, almost unique in Verdi, and it intensifies our interest in the drama rather than alienates us. Now, this conversational, lighter mode that Verdi uses quite a bit in Un ballo in Maschera should remind us that not all tragedy has to be solemn or even depressing. Verdi learnt a lot from Shakespeare. It's surprising how much comedy there is in some of Shakespeare's tragedy. Hamlet, for example, is absolutely filled with comedy, and when it's played comically, does not seem to be particularly violating the... Excuse me, that was just a mistake there. Okay. But anyway, lightness cannot carry the full weight of tragic action. And so, obviously, the light conversational mode is not adequate for all situations, and Verdi could not rely upon it solely. There are passages in ballo that recall the formality of bel canto, particularly those concerning Gustav and Amalia's love. From Amalia's first appearance in Ulrike's Cave, it's clear she belongs to an elevated, serious realm of action. From the start, she is crippled with guilt at betraying her husband. Excuse me, I don't know why this is happening. I'll get to there in a moment. But she belongs to an elevated, serious realm of action. She's crippled with guilt at betraying her husband. But with her, Verdi seems to almost sort of revert to a more traditional, grandiose sort of representation of character. The music recalls both bel canto, and yet it has the size and resonance of grand opera as well. Take, for example, the Love Duet. Now, this is arguably the most celebrated number in the opera. It is a duet with cantabile, tempo di mezzo, and cabaletta. It is notable, by the way, as in Verdi, there are comparatively few love duets. Even in operas such as Il Trovatore, La Traviata, and La Forza nel Destino, there are no love duets in which the characters stand together and sing about and rejoice in their love. But we do have a love duet in ballo. In fact, it is one of the few Verdi operas that does have a fully fledged love duet. When I was writing these notes, I thought I'd play a little game. And so I went on the internet and I collected all the lists of people who put up there of the most important love duets in opera, or my favorite love duets in opera. And I found 12 lists altogether. And do you know the really interesting thing was only one list had the love duet from Un ballo in Maschera as one of the most important duets in opera. I was really rather puzzled by this. It may be because it does have a certain archaic quality. Of all the numbers in Un ballo in Maschera, it is certainly closest in spirit to bel canto. It does have a certain sort of there's more artificial quality than in some of the other numbers. and certainly the duet roughly corresponds to the sections of the bel canto form. Now, what I want to do now is to just play the cantabile up to Amelia's declaration of love for Gustav, and this is followed by a ravishing melody.
Non sai tu che se l'anima mia il rimorso di lacera e rode, quel suo grido non cura non ode, finché l'empiedi fremi di amor. Non sai tu che di te resteria se cessasse di battere il cor. Quante volte ho vegliato anelante, come a lungo infelice lottai, quante volte dal cielo implorai la pietà che tu chiedi da me, ma per questo potuto un istante infelice non viver di te.
Well, I'm not going to play the cabaletta. I'm not actually going to play any more of the love duet, but the cabaletta climaxes with the most graphic description of sexual ecstasy that I think we have in operatic literature. That is something for you all to look forward to, and it is a moment of transfiguring power. Audiences love this climactic moment, and the duet itself is a masterpiece of grandeur, intimacy, and eroticism, with maybe a slightly more elevated level than much of the rest of the opera. The duet has often been compared to the love duet in Tristan and Isolde, due mainly, I think, to the mighty orchestration of the climax. but there can be no question of influence. Verdi was writing in an Italian tradition in which melodies were clear-cut and there was a distinct momentum, while Wagner's duet is wholly different. It's long, it's diffuse, it folds melodies into each other. It has deep harmonies, deep penetrating harmonies. Both of the duets are wonderful, but vive la différence. They cannot have influenced each other because, interestingly enough, the two duets were written at the same time. The Tristan duet was composed between 1858 and 59, but was not played in an opera house until 1865. Ballo was composed at the same time as the love duet in Tristan and Isolde, but that was first performed in 1859. So Wagner would not have had any opportunity to know Verdi's work and vice versa. Now, it was no doubt the opportunity that Auber's opera provided for a mixture of pathos, ironic comedy, and social chatter that attracted Verdi. In Ballo and Maschera, we have the impression that we are experiencing a wide range of society, and at the same time, we feel the onset of tragedy very palpably. This is clear from the most celebrated aria in Ballo and Maschera, which is Ankerstrom's decision not to kill Amelia, which is his first impulse, but to assassinate Gustav instead. In this aria, which is one of those sort of those short arias, we'll be playing the first 2 minutes. Note the insistent trumpet chords that suggest a hardening of Gustav's resolve and strengthens the sense of inevitability that is driving all characters in this work.
Esecrabile l'universo avveleni per me, avveleni per me. Traditori che compensi dal guido dell'amico tuo primo, dell'amico tuo primo. This is one of Verdi's
finest baritone arias. And I think one of the reasons is that the conflicting emotions are closer together, as we can hear as he shifts from one emotion to another, something that actually did not happen that frequently in earlier, more formal modes of opera. And also, if it were a traditional aria, he would be expected to sing a cabaletta, but a cabaletta would have required a display of virtuoso voice and almost certainly be expressive of anger. And it is not just anger that, in fact, Ankerström is feeling here. It is something much more complex. In these shorter arias that are not divided into sections, emotions can intermingle, which make the action psychologically richer and keeps the momentum flowing. That scene, by the way, ends in one of the most remarkable scenes in Verdi, which is when the conspirators come on and Ankerström says he's going to join them, and then they pick straws as to who is going to kill Gustav. And of course, it is picked by Ankerström. But I want you to remember that because the music is eerie in the extreme. It's one of the eeriest things I think that Verdi ever wrote, that you really get the sense of something malign beginning to eat these people, many of whom are actually quite sort of normal and good people. They are not necessarily part of a malign world. Now, Gustav has been off stage for about an hour, and when he returns, he has grown in our estimate. This is where Verdi again learned from Shakespeare, who actually will always take his main character off sort of at the end of Act 3, beginning of Act 4, and then he'll keep him off until the final act, and often he's off for about half an hour. And when he comes back, you say, my God, how this person has changed, how he or she has grown, how they are more sort of stable, and how we maybe trust them more, but understand even more acutely the problems they are in and how they are now going to deal with them. So his final solo is reminiscent of the bel canto aria, actually, with a very big cavatina. This is followed by an intermezzo, which is an interruption by Oscar. And then the final section, when you're expecting a cabaletta, we don't really get that. What we get is the final and the most heroic statement of the melody that identifies Gustav's love for Amelia, which we've heard right the way at the beginning of the opera, in the prelude, and we hear it in various ways, sometimes lyrical, sometimes we hear it sort of winding through the music, but here we hear it as a massive heroic statement. And he sings this just before the ball opens. And for the first time, we are prepared to grant him noble, perhaps even heroic status. Here we have the conclusion of that aria and the beginning of the ball.
Avesse là, potrei vederli, ancora riparlarle potrei, ma no, cor tutto mi strappa da lei.
Ignota donna, questo foglio dimmi, è pel conte di Senna, a lui lo reca e dicela.
E nel ballo alcuna la mia vita tenterà sfadetto, ma se m'arresto, ch'io pavento dirà, non va, nessuno pur sospettarlo de, tu va, t'appresta, per ratto, per giovir me alla festa. Si rivederti Amelia e la tua beltà, ancora volta l'anima
After much intrigue among the conspirators and Oscar, and there's a final meeting between Gustav and Amelia. Gustav is then stabbed by Ankerström. In some versions, he is actually shot by Ankerström. And even as he lies dying on the floor, a very, very powerful effect, we hear the music of dance and jollity and celebration sort of surrounding the stage. And it plays on while this man is dying. And then gradually it stops. It seems to run out of breath and then just completely expires, leaving Gustav to give his final statement, which is that Amelia is innocent. The ending does not have a touch of comedy or irony in it. It is one of Verdi's most moving finales. In actual fact, Gustav III, the historical Gustav III, died 13 days after he was stabbed. He probably died as a result of septicemia from the wound. In other words, probably from poor medical care. And it has since been discovered that his surgeon was one of his political enemies. Ankerström, however, was arrested immediately. He was hung, he was drawn, and he was quartered in a very brutal and painful way. Now, ballo in maschera is one of Verdi's most popular and frequently revived operas. It's a wonderfully concise work. The orchestration is full and ingenious. It follows psychological change in characters. The shades of light and dark are manipulated masterly. The action both has momentum, but the less formal structure of bel canto gives us much closer and quicker access to the characters. And then when occasionally they take up the language of a bel canto, it sounds a little bit archaic, but it lifts them above the normality of the world. For me, above all, the great attraction of ballo, in addition to its wonderful score, is that while the plot and the action are remarkably clear, Verdi never tells us how to feel about his characters. He withholds moral judgment from them. Like all great tragic writers, he presents it to us objectively. And ultimately, we have to respond to what we hear and see on stage from our own personal point of view. However it is, we feel the tragedy that much more strongly when the creator, the composer, or the playwright has created an objectivity of view. There's no other Verdi opera that I ask so many questions about, and there's no other Verdi opera over which I've had such fascinating discussions. No two people will have exactly the same opinion as to what it means. And that fact that they cannot find the same opinion is surely the mark of the greatest of all art, which ballo in maschera belongs to. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm sorry about the few interruptions.
Thank you, Simon. I'm sorry to interrupt as well, but we've gone a little bit over, and I just want to make sure we can squeeze in some questions. So if anyone has any questions remaining, they should please put them in the chat. You can always watch the recording later. We'll answer them, and I'll put the recording on YouTube. We do also have a survey that we're doing right now where you can win free opera tickets. That link is also in the chat. So if you want to potentially win some opera tickets, give us some feedback about how the program is going. Okay, let's get into the Q&A. Also, thank you, Simon. That was really interesting. And we appreciate you being here. So thank you. I I've taken some Q&A questions from people via email. Feel free to do this as well in the future. Anyone in the audience who wants to submit your questions in advance, but you can also send them in now. One of the first ones we have from Melissa Boxer. Simon, she was hoping you might be able to restate some of the things that you said earlier about why the setting was moved from Sweden to Boston. Um, Melissa was curious about why it was set in Sweden in the first place, why you think the Swedish version is better, and why specifically they chose Boston. If you're able to answer that.
I can't tell you why specifically they chose Boston. I suppose they could have chosen Cincinnati or some other American city if it existed then. It was basically because this was a time of real political change. And in Naples, the monarchy only had 2 years to go and eventually would fall to the Risorgimento. And Verdi himself, rightly or wrongly, was associated in the minds of the Italian establishment as being one of those rebels. He was not a man who was clearly part of the establishment. He would have chosen Gustav III, first because of the Auber's opera, which is actually a pretty good piece, though nowhere close in quality to Verdi, but it's a very effective piece of theatre. But also he would have chosen it because it was well known. I don't know, I'm sure other kings had been assassinated round about this time. After all, it was the revolutionary time. It was the time of the French Revolution. So other people went as well. But particularly Gustav III, who actually in many ways was a very good and a very productive king. One might almost say that in some ways he actually tried to put into place, as many other enlightened monarchs did, the sort of the more rational progressive ideas of the time. But eventually he fell foul of his own sort of his own temperament, of his own character. And just, I think it made him a particularly interesting figure. Is that sufficient? I could carry on for a long time more, but I better not.
No, I think that's perfect. It
Right,
explains why the setting was so intriguing and why Boston was arbitrary, but also relevant.
Yeah.
All right, we have a new question from Heather. She Umballa was her favorite Verdi, and she was wondering why you think it isn't more popular.
I don't know. Okay. I can't just pass them up like that. It doesn't quite have the sort of the glitter and the sort of the complete unity that the three Rigoletto, Trovatore, and Traviata does. It's closer to grand opera, which of course is a different mode from bel canto opera, and so that was what Verdi clearly would have known, that he was, after all, the Sicilian Vespers before had been an exercise in grand opera. Simone Boccanegra was as well, and now this opera, and so it was a popular grand operatic form, and this was something that Verdi was really, in fact, moving toward. But there are all sorts of others. I can't understand how it is, in fact, not one of the sort of the 3 or 4 most played operas. I can remember when I first got to see it. I first saw it with John Vickers and Birgit Nilsson at Covent Garden, and then I saw it with Pavarotti and Martina Arroyo, and I saw it in Stockholm as well. And every time I was just sort of taken away by these melodies. But you know, the people who just go to the opera because it's a good thing to do and don't have too much specific knowledge of it, they're perfectly, that's fine to be like that, just to go to what you want to see. But the real opera lovers, and I'm sure we have lots of them here, really like to go beneath. I mean, my favorite Verdi opera actually is Don Carlo, which I think is a sort of an unequaled work of art. That's my own, a result of my own exploration, and I'm sure there are lots of other people who have either Don Carlo or other Verdi operas as their favorite. But really, one has to go in and explore and find your own. It's something you can do well today because we've got all sorts of recordings. But there are still a lot of people who will say, well, because every... let me give you an example. This is not to do with ballo and maschera. It's an interesting talk. I was at the LA Opera where for years, I was the opera news critic for it. And I can remember going to see Braunfels's opera Die Vögel, The Birds. It was a setting of Aristophanes' The Birds. And it was a wonderful thing. I mean, it really was. It was rather like German music if Wagner hadn't been there, which was a really interesting exercise. And I can remember talking to some people, and then somebody came by and I said, it's an absolute scandal that this opera is being put on. I said, well, why? Well, nobody knows it. And I said, how can you expect them to come? Well, actually, there were people there, quite a few, but there was this idea that if it is not actually sanctioned by tradition, we have to be very careful of it. I know maybe I'm sounding a bit radical here, but that's the way I feel.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting answer. I think there is a lot of discourse about the difference between how a lot of European opera houses are given a lot of funding from the state because it's sort of a part of their cultural history, and it's important to put on even less regarded works. But in the US, it's a business, and
Yes.
I think that there's a lot of back and forth about that. So, yeah,
Yeah,
great answer. Interesting.
Yeah.
It's also a good segue. One of our longtime viewers, Helen, has a question for you that you've already kind of answered, but I'm curious to hear a little more. Are there any other incredible operas by Verdi that you believe should be put on more often?
Yes. Stephalio. Stephalio is a magnificent opera. It's a religious opera. I mean, it's not a religious in proper canon as religion, but it deals with the conflict between the individual and religion. And actually, there is a wonderful performance of it by Palmer. It's available on DVD that is really worthwhile seeing. So Stephalio, yes, definitely. I find I enjoy Louisa Miller a lot. It's not, I think, quite up there with the sort of on the top tier, but it certainly requires more revivals than it gets. About 20 years ago, I'd have said Macbeth. I don't have to say that so much now because that is seen a lot, and it is, again, one of his remarkable works, one of his major works. So those are the ones. Actually, you better come and ask me because next month I'm traveling to Italy, and we're going to the Verdi Festival in Parma, where they're actually doing on ballo and maschera, but also they're doing La Battaglia di Legnano that very few people have seen. And I'm looking forward to that because that may well be an opera that should be seen a little bit more frequently.
Well, maybe we can send out a little article to our Eventbrite subscribers about your experience.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I wonder what production they'll be doing when you see it. Just for our audience, we are doing the Rome Opera's production. I'll put a link in the chat so you can see some images of the production that we're doing at San Francisco Opera. But I think we can probably stop soon so we don't go to 2 hours. But Peggy, if you want to give our final announcements, I'll put some links in the chat. But thank you again, Simon. This was really wonderful and fascinating.
Well, thank you for joining us today. And just a reminder that the Opera Ball is coming up Friday, September 6th. There's still tickets available. It's a great fundraiser for both the opera and the San Francisco Opera Guild. If you can't get to the Opera House itself to see Ballo, well, you can live stream it on Sunday, October 15th, 2 p.m., $27.50. Just you need to get on the San Francisco Opera website, as you do for almost everything, including our previews. And our next preview, Handmaid's Tale, it'll be virtual on Tuesday evening at 6 p.m. with our speaker, Laura Pritchard. And It's been a long evening, but thank you for joining us. Thank you, Simon Williams. Thank you, Max, for everything. It's been a fest, and I'm so looking forward to seeing the opera, as I'm sure you all are now. Thank you and good night. Bye-bye.